in just a few moments. Okay, it looks like we've got people still joining, but it is 10:16 according to my clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's 2021-22 SFA workshop for Residency and WASFA, and this one is specific for public institutions. So if you are a private institution, you are welcome to join. If you're someone else, you're also welcome to join, but private institutions, we are having one specific to you this afternoon. So if you're able to join that one, that might be more useful for you. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, today's presenters are Gabi, who's from our Student Financial Assistance Office, and me, Gail Wooten. I'm with our Consumer Protection Office, and I work on student residency. Gabi works on the WASFA. I'm starting us off to talk about residency, since that's the basis of what we want to make sure you understand, and then we're going to dig into WASFA. I've also shared the residency website here for you to look at for future reference, because you're probably going to have a lot of questions. Before we get started, some housekeeping. First, just want to make it clear that this is actually an hour webinar. There were conflicting times on the invitation, so we're going to be here till 11:15. We'll actually stay longer if we have to answer questions. So for those of you who are really excited, you can hang on. We're in webinar format, so we've put you all on mute, and we've also disabled the chat function. So if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A box. We do have Carla acting as our session moderator who will review questions and share with us. And we are anticipating a lot of questions today, so please do not be offended if we can't answer all of them. We will follow up with you if we're able, if we missed your question. And finally, this is being recorded and we'll share out later. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, I work on residency here at WASAC, and we're talking today about the intersection of residency and state financial aid. And the three primary things I'm going to be talking about are how are residency decisions made, residency and how it connects to state aid, and then residency specifically for people who file the WASFA. So who makes residency decisions for state financial aid? This is, if I were to open it up to you, 100 and some odd people that we have on the call, I would hope you would all say residency officers, because that is the correct answer. So your residency officer makes the decision about who gets resident tuition, which is also the same decision of who qualifies for resident, who meets residency requirements for state aid. So the piece that we really want to make sure you walk away with is that at the public institutions, your residency officer should really be communicating with the financial aid office as to how a student met the residency requirements. And I'm going to go more into why that matters. But there's so many ways to meet residency that if a residency office just says to the financial aid officer, this student is a resident, the financial aid office doesn't necessarily know how that student met residency, and then they therefore don't know what financial aid options are available to them. So if you don't already have a good way of communicating between the two offices, we really encourage you to do so. And today's call, there should be residency officers and financial aid officers on the call. And again, we hope the takeaway today is that you sit down and meet with each other to talk about how you're going to communicate better if you don't already. The other big takeaway is that we want to make it clear that the financial aid office does not redetermine residency. They take the decision that the residency officer makes and they apply it to the information that they know about aid. So if a student meets residency requirements for an aid program, the financial aid office also has to look to see if they meet program requirements. However, financial aid offices the good thing about having two offices connected to one student is that the financial aid office might see a red flag about a student's residency. If that's the case, the financial aid office should reach back out to the residency officer to talk about, hey, is this person really a resident? And so it really allows you to have a couple eyes on that student. And if any of the rest of you on the call are not residency staff, we really encourage you not to be answering residency questions. Send those directly to your residency officer. That person is the expert. I'm here to help them if they get any weird, wonky questions, but we really want that decision to be made in the residency office. And then of course, communication will help the financial aid office make their decisions. Carla, are there any questions that have come up related to that? I don't see any.
None at this time.
Okay. So I mentioned there are lots of ways to meet residency, and it matters how a student meets residency requirements. So depending on how you count, we've got 25 to 30 ways that a student can meet residency requirements for resident tuition. And depending on which resident tuition requirement they meet, depends on which financial aid program they can meet residency requirements for. So all 25 plus of those ways actually meet residency requirements for these four financial aid programs: work study, state work study, passport to careers, the American Indian Endowed Scholarship, and the National Guard Education Grant, which is new. We're not talking about that today, but if you have questions about it, you can reach out to us or check our website. But basically, all 25 plus ways meet the residency requirements, and then the student has to meet whatever other requirements are in that program. What we're going to focus on today actually is the 5 ways that a student meets residency requirements for the Washington College Grant and the College Bound Scholarship, which, as you know, or hopefully most of you know, are our 2 biggest programs. And now that Washington College Grant is an entitlement, it's very important for you all to understand the residency requirements here. And again, going back to the residency officer speaking to the financial aid officer, we want your financial aid office to know, they need to know if they met one of these 5 ways. And so you have to figure out a way to communicate that. What are those 5 ways? So our residency law is RCW 28B 15012, and those 25 plus ways fall under section 2. And most of you are probably familiar with the first 2. You know, if you have a financially independent student, they have to have a domicile here for a year. If they're dependent, their parent has to have a domicile for a year. The third option, I'm calling it a unicorn because I don't think any of you are ever going to see this. The fourth is kind of rare or just not as common. And so really these 5 are really 3, because the first 2 are the ones you're going to see the most. And the 5th one, E, is the third probably most common out of these 5. And this third one you can see is potentially new to some of you, if you remember what the previous version of this was. So this used to be called, we used to call this 1079, and that's because it was referring to an old bill from 2003. That was the bill number. We want to make sure you are calling this the residency affidavit, because just this year, that law has been changed. And for those of you who are really familiar with this law, you can see that it has changed from a student having to live here for 3 years prior to high school graduation to a student only having to live here for 1 year prior to their first term of college. So this is new. You are the first group to whom we are sharing this information publicly. So we're going to obviously go into this more. And this law is actually called our tuition equity law because it is meant to support undocumented students, although it is open to all students. So just a quick overview, the 5 is actually more of a 3, and we're really going to be focusing on this new law. Any questions there?
No new questions now.
Okay. So as I mentioned, we're also talking about what does residency mean for WASFA filers. So WASFA is the state application for aid that we created a while back for people who don't qualify for federal aid due to their immigration status, but they can qualify for state aid because of their residency status. Anyone can actually fill this application out, and Gabi will go into more details, but students are should only be filling out either a WASFA or a FAFSA. And most non-citizens are going to be filling out the WASFA because many non-citizens don't qualify for federal aid due to their immigration status, including undocumented students. And you can see on this slide, there's people who have temporary protected status, people who are pending asylum, various non-immigrant visas. These are the folks who fill out a WASFA. Of course, people with DACA or without DACA. There are, just as an FYI, some non-citizens who qualify for federal aid, and your financial aid office should know that, but they include permanent residents, of course, but refugees and asylees, so people who do have asylum, people with a T visa, and there's a few others. So if you ever have a student or you yourself don't know which application they should file, just send them to the WASFA, and there's a questionnaire that takes them through to tell them which application is appropriate for them. We're not going to get into the FAFSA today. We're just talking about WASFA. So, and we're talking about residency in WASFA. So for those who do file a WASFA, they have two ways to meet residency requirements, or two ways that they can be considered for residency. The first is through the residency affidavit. So that's letter E from that RCW. And again, E has changed, and we're obviously going to talk about that next. And if they don't meet E, then they have to have a qualifying immigration status. And we'll talk very briefly about that, but I think you're going to find that this change to the law has made it so that most of your students filing the WASFA who are going to get residency are going to get it through the residency affidavit. So I'm going to go into more detail about those new requirements, and then I'll open it up for questions unless this question I see is related to this slide. Carla.
This question is the 1-year requirement for any state college, or if they attend one term at a Washington college, then wait a year to come to your college, will they be able to be considered a resident?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and we will answer it in the next couple slides. So let's dig into this new change, this new law. So right here, what we have is what the current law is, what HB 1079 was. And that was the law that was passed in 2003. And through July 24th, that law said that students who earned a high school diploma or equivalent in the state of Washington, who lived in Washington for 3 consecutive years, 36 months prior to earning that diploma, and then continued to live here until they went to college, and then signed an affidavit attesting to that this was true, and that if they weren't a citizen or permanent resident, that they would apply for permanent residency when eligible. Those are the students who would get resident tuition. And my hope is that you all are very familiar with that law. So starting on the 25th of July, in green, we have a much simpler law. So instead of having to earn a high school diploma in Washington or equivalent, it can be anywhere in the US. And instead of living in Washington for 3 years prior to high school graduation or GED, they have to live here for a year, 12 consecutive months immediately before their first term for which they were admitted. And then of course the affidavit is still there. I'm going to go to the another slide that I have that kind of answers a couple questions that I was anticipating, and I'll also answer the question that Carla just posed. So a couple questions I anticipated was, what does it mean if it's effective on 7/25? Does it apply to our summer term? And it depends on when your term starts. So as our residency officers know, students have 30 calendar days into the term to get residency, get a residency determination to apply for residency. So if your if your term, if 725 lands within that 30-day window of your term, then the student could qualify. If your term starts 30 days prior to the 25th, which I know a lot of yours do, then it's going to be the following term, whether that's a summer B term or your fall or autumn term. The other question I was anticipating, and this is almost similar to the question that Carla had, and that is, can continuing students qualify? So what I meant by that is, if you have a student who is currently a resident, or who was a non-resident for 2021, and maybe they started in fall 2020, they're continuing into fall 21, if that student can show or sign the affidavit saying that they lived in Washington for 1 year prior to that first term that they were admitted, then they could now get, for fall or potentially summer, they could now get resident tuition and therefore meet residency requirements for all of our aid programs, including Washington College Grant. If you have a student who's entering their second year who did not live in Washington, maybe they moved here, let's talk during non-COVID times, but maybe they moved here last fall to go to school. Sure, they've lived here a year before this upcoming term, but they didn't live here a year before the term for which they're admitted. So it's really about that term they were admitted for. So with the question that came up about a student who, and I hope I'm going to answer this or catch this correctly, a student who is applying to your school, if they lived here a year before before the term for which they were admitted to your school, then they would get resident tuition at your school. So that could mean you have someone who moved here a year or two ago and was going to another school. Maybe they were going as a non-resident. They would then apply, and if they apply to your school, get in, and the term they start, they've lived here for a year before that first term, they are a resident for tuition purposes. And of course, if they meet Washington College Grant program requirements, then they could also qualify for WCG. So I do see that there are some questions about this, and we can answer all the questions about this new law, and then I'm actually going to talk more in depth about how the affidavit works. But what questions do we have, Carla?
So they leave the current college and go to another college and begin getting residency, correct?
If they can show that they have a high school diploma and that they've lived here for 1 year prior to starting that first term at your college.
This is going to encourage students to move colleges for the benefit. Why is this rule in place?
This law is in place because it was made for students who were not able to get resident tuition through the current version. So the law benefits undocumented students, and there were plenty of undocumented students who could not meet the current law that required living here for 3 years before getting a Washington high school diploma. So if you had a student who moved here from another state and they already had a high school diploma, there was no way for them to get resident tuition. And now this allows for anyone who lives in Washington and considers it their home to get resident tuition.
Is that start of the full term or start of a part of a term?
Oh, it's the 1 year before the term for which they were admitted. So if you have a student who was admitted for winter term, it's 1 year before winter. Spring, 1 year before spring. Summer, 1 year before summer. I did get a question from one of you about what if a student defers, and I don't know the answer to that yet. So I don't know, like if you had a student who was admitted for fall 2021 and they've been living here only for 9 months, and let's say they deferred for another term, and they deferred because they wanted to show that they've lived here for a year before that deferred term, which term do we use? And I don't know yet. And actually, I do want to give a disclaimer that we are still figuring this out. So obviously some of the questions you have, I may not have an answer for. And some of the information we've shared today may get some further clarification. So we are going to be sending out a memo to our residency officers that we will share with the financial aid officers. And that's going to have more details, especially it will be based on a lot of the questions that come up today. So we really need and appreciate your questions because it's helping us flesh out all the different details about this law.
Does the presumption about living here for reasons other than education also apply for the 1 year prior to admitted term?
Nope, it's just the student must live here for a year. And I do want to point out that live is different than domicile, which a lot of your residency officers know. Living is maintaining and occupying a primary residence in the state of Washington. So you could have someone whose domicile, maybe their permanent address, is actually in another state or even country. But if they've lived here, if they've basically physically been present for a year or can show that this was their primary residence for a year, they can get residency. And you're not looking, they aren't being asked on the affidavit if the reason they've been here has been for education.
Could international students qualify for the residency affidavit?
Yep, and they currently can qualify. Any student qualifies for the residency affidavit. The way the law is written is it doesn't exclude or prioritize any student population.
Is this applied to undocumented students? Will they also be able to obtain WASFA or just the ability to pay in-state tuition?
So students who meet the requirements of this law, I'm actually going to go back to this slide so you can see in green. Students who meet those requirements and sign an affidavit saying that they meet those requirements, they meet residency requirements for in-state tuition. And then the residency officer would then notify the financial aid officer that they meet residency requirement. The residency officer would let the financial aid officer know that they meet residency requirements for tuition. They meet it through E or through the affidavit. And then the financial aid officer would know E is one of the 5, and therefore they meet financial aid, residency requirements for Washington College Grant and College Bound. And then the financial aid officer would look to see if they meet the income requirements for those programs. And we're going to talk more about the WASFA, but most of the students who are qualifying for this are actually going to be signing the affidavit through the WASFA. So your financial aid officers will see in the WASFA that they've met the affidavit. So that communication from the residency officer may not have to happen if the student has filed the WASFA and signed the affidavit as part of that.
What if a student got a high school diploma from another country? Will they qualify?
At this time, the interpretation from the Attorney General's office is that the intent of the law was for US and territories high school diplomas to count here. Because I did specifically ask about foreign diplomas, and at this point, the answer is it needs to be in the US. But I'm going to be discussing that further, and the memo that we put together will include confirmation or denial of that.
If a student applies for fall 2021 and hasn't met their 1 year here in Washington, but never attends, and then reapplies for winter 2022, but now qualifies for the residency affidavit for fall 2022, they can't be determined as resident? That's a question. For typical residency, if a student is out for more than 1 year, we can redetermine their residency without a residency packet.
So my answer to that is basically going to be, it's about the admission. So if a student has been readmitted, if the 12 months is prior to that first term for which they've been admitted, then they're good. So if you had a student who was on like a leave of absence and they're just continuing enrollment after 3 months or 6 months or a year or whatever, my inclination is to say that this law does not apply to them. But if you have a student who drops out and then reapplies and is readmitted, then my inclination is to say that it's about the student who's been admitted to an institution. We will make sure that the memo we put together makes that clear. It's kind of similar to the deferment that I was talking about. We're not quite sure how deferment's going to apply here.
Would this apply to an international student who graduates from their home country but obtains a GED?
Yes.
Are you saying if they are in an F1 visa, they could qualify?
Yes, an F1 visas qualify now. If the student can meet these requirements and sign an affidavit, here's the other thing. The student has to sign an affidavit saying they will apply for U.S. permanent residency when they are eligible. So students have to be comfortable signing that, and that includes F visa students. They have to know that they're signing this thing, and we do recommend that they consult with an immigration attorney if they're concerned about how that may affect their visa status. But if you have a student filing this, it doesn't matter what their current immigration status is. It's them saying this is true for me, and that can include F visa students. And you would not be investigating any further unless you saw red flags on the application, which I'm going to talk about in more depth when I talk about the affidavit itself.
Okay, Gail, you have 6 more questions in this section. Do you want to try to
I'm
take
gonna,
care of them or keep going?
I'm gonna, let me talk about the affidavit a little, and I only have a few more slides, and then we can answer more questions. So I've talked about this, I've talked about this. So more about the affidavit. So another big takeaway we want to make sure that you have is that the affidavit is found in 2 places: the WASFA, which is again the application for students who don't qualify for federal aid, and there's also a paper affidavit, and those are for students who are filing the FAFSA. So that's going to be primarily U.S. citizens and permanent residents. And the main takeaway is students should only be submitting one of these. So students who are filing the WASFA, as part of the WASFA process, are being asked the affidavit questions and are being asked to certify or affirm that they meet these requirements and that they'll apply to be a permanent resident when they're eligible. So what we don't want is to have students being told, fill out the WASFA and then fill out this paper affidavit and give it to the residency office. So the way we're going to alleviate that is we really encourage your residency officers to work with the financial aid office to get the WASFA residency report. This report tells the residency office who is a resident based on if they signed the affidavit. And then that would allow the residency office to code them as a resident for tuition purposes, which again tells the financial aid office, even though the financial aid office would already know because they've signed the affidavit, it tells them that the student is a resident. You all have your own processes and can do it in whichever way works for you. My suggestion is that the financial aid office, even though I said this differently, even though the financial aid office can see who signed the affidavit, my suggestion is that you actually confirm with your residency office, because the residency office may see something, a red flag that makes them investigate further. So for example, if a student says, yep, I meet these affidavit requirements on the WASFA, and the residency office sees, wait a second, their admission materials don't have a Washington address. What's going on here? How can this student have lived here for a year? So they would then reach out to the student and ask for more materials to ensure that what they said on the affidavit is correct. We're not asking you to double check that the student applies for permanent residency. We're only asking that you keep an eye out for people who don't have a Washington address, or maybe there's no indication of or there's indication of no high school diploma. But really, this is an affidavit. These students are signing a document saying this is true for me. And the other thing too is that you don't have to have the student file. The residency officers use a residency questionnaire particularly for those A and B questions, those domicile students. And these students don't need to be filing a residency questionnaire unless it turns out that you find out that the student actually doesn't meet residency through this affidavit, and there's no other way for them to show residency except through filing the residency questionnaire. So any questions there about one more thing, Gabi's actually going to go into more detail about the residency report, how to access it, how to read it, what you're looking for. So that's the important next part of this presentation. Questions about the affidavit?
There's a couple of comments and questions. If a student has a high school diploma, they cannot take the GED, but the reverse is true. So that is just a comment that was made. And then I understand the intent of the law. However, why are they requiring the student to move schools in order to get the benefit of resident tuition? If they want to benefit the student, they would allow continuing students to prove they have been in the state for 1 year or more, like other students, and allow the continuing student to receive the benefit of resident tuition without disrupting their education. So more comment than question. When will we receive the new form to provide to students?
Good question. And I meant to talk a little bit more about the paper affidavit. So the paper affidavit is probably going to be updated this week or next week. And on that paper affidavit, it actually says at the top, if you are filing the WASFA, you need to, or if you're basically, if you're not eligible for the FAFSA, go to the WASFA, file the affidavit there. So it tells the student, don't fill this out if you're a WASFA filer. So that's one thing. And really, again, the affidavit is only for the FAFSA filers, and then your residency office would be hanging on to that. And again, telling the financial aid office, hey, I got a paper affidavit, looks good. This student's a resident for tuition purposes. And we're going to talk more, Gabi's going to talk more about particularly this transition year, because we know that there are students that are currently attending who are going to be qualifying for next year, and it's going to require some work on your behalf to figure out who those students are and notify them. So I already know that one of your offices, residency offices, is aware of the students who maybe last year didn't qualify, but now we know are going to qualify, and they're going to have to reach out to them and tell them, fill out this paper affidavit. The same is going to go with the WASFA, where the WASFA, we're going to ask that you manually look through that and figure out who now qualifies and code them as such. And again, Gabi's going to talk more about that.
If a student lived here for 1 year but got their high school diploma from another country, will they qualify for WASFA? So one thing to share about the WASFA, and Gabi will talk about this more too, the WASFA itself is an application for state aid. So technically everyone qualifies for the WASFA because it's really just an application. The financial aid office uses the WASFA like they do the FAFSA to figure out who qualifies for whether it's state aid in the case of the WASFA and institutional aid in the case of the WASFA, or in the case of the FAFSA, federal, state, and institutional aid. So, but my guess is the question was really about who can qualify for this residency affidavit law, and does a non-US high school count? And at this time, we're saying that the high school diploma has to be from the US. And again, the guidance that we put out in the future will be more in depth about the foreign diploma. Will students still need to show their diploma or GED?
The student does not need to show that because they're signing an affidavit attesting that it's true. I'm assuming this question is from a two-year institution, which typically doesn't require a diploma. So if you have a concern that it seems like their maybe their admission application makes you think, wait a second, I don't think they have a diploma, then you can ask for it.
Living versus domicile. I thought the student had to establish domicile in Washington for other than educational purposes. Is that no longer applicable?
That is still applicable, and I'm going to go back to our 5 ways. Oops, here we go. So you're talking about A. So A is still in effect, where if you have a financially independent student, they have to show that they've had a domicile here for reasons other than education. But if a student can't show that, they can now show that they've lived here in Washington for 1 year prior to their first term. So there's going to be people who might meet A and not E and vice versa. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. Really, your process isn't going to change. Like, I know most of you at the time of admission, you determine if a student is a resident or non-resident, typically based on their the amount of time they've been in the state. None of that should change. Like, you're still going to be coding your students in that way. It's E is for the students who don't meet A or B or D and maybe C, and for the students who we know are filing the WASFA. So it's not replacing that law, but it's there as, like, I guess I'd say it's there as a backup. So if the student can't show it through A, can they show it through E? If they can't show it through E, can they show it through one of the other 25 ways? And again, for WASFA filers, they have these 2 options, the residency affidavit, which we've talked about. And if they don't meet that, and here's the thing, most of them are going to. Most of them are going to meet having lived here for a year and having a high school diploma. If they don't, they have to have a qualifying immigration status. And actually, let me just show that, because that's my last slide. They have to have a qualifying residency, or sorry, immigration status. And in the past, we've called this, last year we called this the 1079 standard and the non-1079 standard. And years before that, we called it the 1079 standard and the DACA standard. Well, we're changing that to the residency affidavit, which I've talked about, and qualifying immigration status. Because if a student doesn't meet that residency affidavit, they have to have a qualifying immigration status. These are some of them. The most common are going to be DACA, current or expired, or having a work permit. But there's lots of others, and your residency officers know about these. And if they have one of those, they then can be run through the same process as any US citizen. So that's checking to see financially independent, financially dependent. So for example, you might have a student who is financially dependent and they've not been living in Washington this whole time, but they happen to have a parent here who's had a 1-year domicile. They're not going to meet the affidavit, but they might have, if they have a qualifying immigration status, they might be able to get residency that way. And I'll allow for a couple more questions. I'm going to just pull up my final takeaways that I want you to know, but I have time for a couple more questions, then we want to move on to Gabi so we can be sure you have the right WASFA information.
These forms, are electronic signatures acceptable?
The paper affidavit at this point is literally a paper form that a student signs and delivers to you. If your process is allowing them to sign it electronically, that's up to you, especially with COVID. But the WASFA it's all electronic. It's a checkbox, and that's been approved.
How do we get that residency report?
Great question, and a great segue into Gabi's part of the presentation. I say let's go ahead and move to Gabi, and then if we have more time at the end of that, we'll answer some of these remaining questions. So Gabi, I'm going to stop my share so that you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Just one moment, please. Okay. All right. Can I get confirmation that you can see my presentation?
It's not there yet. Give it just a minute. Not coming up.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Let me try again. Is it showing yet?
Nope.
Bobby, do you want me to try sharing my screen?
Yeah, if you could, please. Sorry about that, folks. We are going to get this. Okay, great. Okay, now are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can take charge of this. If Colleen can give me the access to take over control. Okay, so we're going to go over, I'm going to quickly go over what the WASFA is. I'm going to kind of skip along quickly because we are a little bit shorter on time. Okay, it's not giving me the access to forward the slide. So Colleen, if you could forward the slide for me. So what is the WASFA? The WASFA is actually an application like Gail had mentioned previously. It's for students who don't qualify for federal financial aid because of immigration status, defaulted federal loans, repayments owed, unable to provide selective service confirmation, US citizens with undocumented parents, family members. So what that means is that not only is it for students who have the citizenship status, if their parents are non-citizens and they are citizens, they may choose to do the WASFA as well, based on not wanting to provide that information to the FAFSA. If we can go ahead and go to the next. So like the FAFSA, students complete a new application each year. It's available October 1st of every year, and the students can access it at our wasac.wa.gov WASFA site. The other way to access it is through the Ready, Set, Grad link, which is phasing out. So we want to start directing students over to the wasac.wa.gov. However, they will still be redirected. So they have multiple ways to get there. We wanted to make sure that that you are aware that all of the data that is collected on the WASFA can only be used for the sole purpose of determining eligibility for state financial aid programs. There's should not be sharing this, and it should not be used for any other types of programs. We have the privacy statement pretty prominently up on the site for the students so that they can be assured that WASAC is protecting their information. So an overview of the application statistics, we've been going up since 2017. As you see right now, 2021, that application is open, and the 21-22 application is currently open. So at this time, at the 6 months, we're already at over 3,000 for 2021, and the 21-22 is even higher for the 6 months count. And we won't know the full cycles until after they close. Okay, next, please. Next, please. So funding for students who complete a WASFA, all students who meet eligibility must be awarded Washington College grant, since it is now an entitlement program. And also anybody who is college bound should also be awarded college bound. The WASFA runs parallel to the FAFSA. So we want to make sure that all students are treated equitably, and they all have equitable opportunities. So you will want to evaluate your WASFA students the same way you do all of your FAFSA students, and award using the same process. No differences. Next, please. Okay, so the difference between the WASFA and the FAFSA, students with the WASFA are only getting state aid, not for federal aid. If the FAFSA has the automatic verification process, whereas WASFA does not. So we are asking that you verify your students. If you find any information that's conflicting, we want you to go ahead and do the confirmation of information. However, it's not automatic. Also, unlike the FAFSA, students filing the WASFA, they are not required to file tax returns. So you're going to evaluate those students the same way you do any other non-tax filers. Next, please. Okay, so as Gail had mentioned before, the financial aid staff are the ones who are determining if students meet eligibility requirements for the state aid programs, such as the high school graduation, GPA, family income, quarters of eligibility, etc. The college residency officers will make the student residency, determine the student's residency status, and share that along with the financial aid office. So the residency report that you folks are asking about is part of the WASFA in our WASAC portal, which the financial aid officers, office staff have access to. So you will want to work directly with them for them to share that information with the residency officers. Okay, next slide, please. So as Gail mentioned before, the affidavit is part of the WASFA, and it's in the portal. And I'm going to go over how to review and identify your students who may be affected by this new law. Because like we mentioned, the 2021-22 residency changes are happening, and the application is currently already open. So we have had many students already filing the 2021-22 application who may need reevaluation. Okay, next slide, please. So in the WASFA interface, the financial aid offices have access. Contact your institutional administrator if you don't have that permission. And if you were in Victor's previous presentation, we do have a new permission there for financial aid folks to make corrections to the WASFA, so that's exciting. The applicant information is available in the WASFA portal the day after the student submits the WASFA. And you will only be able to see a student's WASFA if your school is added to their application. So if they're saying that they did do one and you don't see it, it could be that they didn't put your school on. So you're going to ask them to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're talking about the residency changes. Gail did a great job going over what they were. I'm sure you still have some more questions and we'll try to get to those at the end. The 2021-22 WASFA is currently open, like you said, and they're going to be needed to be manually reviewed. The 22-23 WASFA will have the new residency language updated, and we're working with our vendor Regent to get that done. We are going to try to get it updated on the 21-22. However, there's no guarantee that they'd be able to get to it. And that's why we were really looking at the manual evaluations. Okay, so in the portal, we can go ahead and skip this, move forward from this slide, please. Okay, so for the financial aid office folks, you should be somewhat familiar with the interface inside our WASFA portal. You're going to want to make sure you select the correct year for the student because there are multiple years open at the time. So make sure you're looking at the right application year. And you can show all the new transactions or you can show all of the transactions. These reports are downloadable in CSV or ISA format. And we're going to suggest that you do the CSV if you're going to be sharing the residency affidavit. If you look over to the right a little bit, there is a box that says residency data only, and that is what you're going to click on to get the residency report. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so if you look below, it shows what the the information is going to come up looking like for the residency information. So this is what it looks like when it gets pulled up on the screen. Now, if you could go ahead and switch the slide. This is what it's going to look like in the CSV format. So if you notice, I have some highlighted fields. There's a lot more information on the report than is showing here. I condensed it down so that you're only looking at what you need to look at. If you notice that there are two columns that are crossed out and grayed out, those are from those are fields that we required in prior years and no longer require. We did have an update to the WASFA not too long ago, and so those fields changed. We're looking at seeing if we could get them hidden, but in the meantime, please just disregard those two fields. All right. If you could go back one slide, please. Okay, if you could click on the user link down below, Colleen, and see if we can open up the sample file that I put together.
It's not letting me open it.
Oh, because it's on my, okay. Goodness, how can I get this to show? Okay, I'm going to, okay. So unfortunately, I'm not able to open the report, but from here, you know, I really want to try. How are we on time? Or do we have some questions that we could answer?
We do have some questions to answer related to the WASFA. And you have, it looks like about 5 minutes.
Okay.
The WASFA opens in October. When does it close?
It closes on June 30th.
At the end of the academic year for which it's being processed. So it has a long opening. How do we get permission to access the WASFA report?
Okay, Colleen, could you please go back to a few screens to where we showed the,
I think you're controlling it now, so you should be able to maybe go back up to that link. The last two advances, you did them.
did I?
Yep, two.
That's magical. But now there's nothing there.
Click up one more time. There, oh, there we go.
Okay, are you seeing the full
Yep.
full thing?
It's the other view, but it's okay. It's not
Okay.
working.
Okay. So here on this screen, slideshow, no, from current slide. Okay, are you still able to see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I don't know why that went back. Something is magical on this.
Good morning.
It doesn't want to work for me. Okay, so on this screen in the interface, if you have WASFA Access, which is in the financial aid office, your institutional administrator can give you access if you don't already have it. And what you will do is you're going to click on this residency data only field inside the WASFA. Okay.
Currently, when downloading the residency file, you receive all applications to date on every list. Will there be an added functionality to download only residency applications that are new or for a specific date range?
Okay, you can currently do that. You can either click on this button over here where it says only the new transactions, and that's going to show you all of the applications that have not been downloaded in ICER format. So once the financial aid office downloads an ICER format, that new goes away. But you can download that. Also here up above, you can choose, there used to be a date range. I'll have to look at that. I used to have a date range that you should be able to just pull from a certain date. But I'd have to go play in that. And you definitely can contact me after the presentation or anytime, and I'm happy to walk you through these screens. We could do it as a group with your school. We could do it on an individual basis, but please reach out to me and I will go over this in detail with you if you'd like.
How is the report updated? Is it a scheduled automated job?
The report is going to be opened, I'm sorry. The report is updated overnight, every night, when the new applications are processed. So when students do their applications during the day or night, it goes overnight through the process of updating, and then it is fed back into the WASFA portal, where we can now see all the newest transactions that have came in. So when you download that report, and unfortunately I can't open the full version, but what you can do is you can do the filter on top of the titles and filter out the students you want or don't want. You could start off by taking the students from state of residency. If they're not claiming Washington, you would take those off and not look at those students. So you would just go down all of the columns and sort them out until you get the students that need to be reevaluated.
Is it a college business process determination? Is the report ran by the financial aid office, or should residency officers have access to the WASFA report?
Well, the WASFA report is strictly for the financial aid office to run. They can give them a copy of the Excel spreadsheet. So that spreadsheet could be shared between the two offices.
Okay, and I think that is the last question. Gail, did you want to respond to the final comment related to, we normally send every student who indicates that they are undocumented or leave the citizen or permanent residence boxes blank, the residency affidavit with their acceptance letter. Often they haven't completed a WASFA yet.
Yeah, I was just typing to that and I realized my mic was on, so I hope you didn't hear me typing. If you did, I'm sorry. Yeah, I actually think that's a great practice to share the residency affidavit with their acceptance letter, because the current affidavit, the paper affidavit, actually says at the top to only fill out the paper affidavit if you are filing the FAFSA. And you can't assume that all non-citizens are not FAFSA eligible, because as I think I shared, people who are refugees or asylees can actually file a FAFSA. So I think that's a good practice. But yeah, definitely. And then you would know as the residency office, once they file the WASFA or the paper affidavit, then they've completed that part of the residency steps.
To clarify, if a student was not eligible by House Bill 1079 previously by residency, when they completed the 21-22 application, they will need to complete the new affidavit form now?
Yes, so, but it depends on their situation. If they've filled out the WASFA already for 21-22, then you would want to go through the manual review as Gabi mentioned. If they're not eligible for the WASFA, if you know they're not eligible for the WASFA and would be filing a FAFSA, then you would have them file a paper affidavit. But one of the questions that I typed an answer to was, if someone had qualified for the old affidavit, do they qualify for the new? And yes. So, and that was about if someone accidentally submits an old affidavit, would they count for this new one? And that is yes.
And so just to follow up and let everybody know that Gail was able to type a lot of the answers in the Q&A. And so you can, everybody has the ability to view those, as well as we can share them out. And right now there's no open questions in the Q&A, so it looks like it's a wrap.
Oh, I do see a quick one.
Oh, one just came in. Gail, just to confirm, E, little letter E now means that U.S. high school students can graduate, move to Washington, and be eligible for resident status 1 year later, regardless of independence or parent domicile.
Dan, I think you just summed up the exact question that I think everybody has. I think you are correct. I am confirming that regardless of the student's dependency or where their parents live, if they came here, have lived here for a year, got their high school diploma in another state, they are now eligible. Currently, the only undocumented students who could qualify were people who had DACA or used to have DACA. And there's, as we know, plenty of students who don't qualify for DACA who are still undocumented. So now we are, the legislature has decided to support those students beyond those with DACA. And we're also talking about US citizens, correct? Because currently the current affidavit supports US citizens. That is due to federal law.
Okay. Seeing no new questions, give it a minute maybe. Can we start using the residency affidavit for summer residency reviews once we receive a copy? Our summer 30th deadline is after the July 25th date.
Okay, that's great. So the 25th falls within your 30-day window. So yes, you would want to use the affidavit for summer residency. And the affidavit, the paper one, will be available hopefully this week or next week, and I'm going to share it out with the residency officers.
Are you going to send the Q&A list out with the PowerPoint? The answer to that is yes, we can do that. When and where will the recording be made available? Our intent is to send out a copy of the recording to all attendees, as well as to post it on the WASAC website. And all of the workshops that we've hosted both last week and through this week will be posted there and made available. Okay. I think that's it.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, please reach out if you'd like me to help you go look through the residency report. I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, thanks for your questions, and please send any other questions that come up to you that are tricky, because it's going to help me, especially with my guidance out to you all in consultation with our Attorney General's office.